All right, it's time to be kind of honest about this thing. So I wanted to cover the form over function versus price and maybe some comparability of to other things. So yeah, let's get into it. Hey, what's going on? So this is the, if you're not familiar, the POM400 Pocket Operator Modular by Teenage Engineering. Basically their version of a Eurorack synthesizer or modular synth, whatever you want to call it, in this format that they got going on here, you know? So with that, the format of it, I kind of wanted to talk about some of the pros and cons about this thing. I've owned it, I want to say about a month now. Been using it here and there. And yeah, I just kind of wanted to focus in and look at some of the stuff. So I have a little list here of some pros and cons, and I guess for the form side of things, some of the pros, it looks badass. It's cool. It's yellow, love or hate type of thing that some people might like. Me personally, I love it. I like the yellow color. It's cool. It's not like, has this nice like almost warm yellow, not that highlighter yellow. So that to me is a pro. It looks badass on a table. It looks badass in any studio. Kind of pops out. You know, you can always have a bunch of pieces that are all black, but then it's nice to have a little pop of color here and there. Could be cool. That's kind of it for the pros of the form. When it comes to some of the cons, though, is it has this somewhat of a weird shape, right? It's not fully tilted back, and it's not fully straight up. With that, it kind of has this weird way of using it where you're like this all the time. And to me, that kind of is like writing on a chalkboard or a whiteboard, you know, and your wrist is just busted the entire time. So after a while, it does kind of start to hurt. And with the form, it's a little wobbly because the back half isn't as heavy as the front. The front clearly has a lot more weight. But when it comes to plugging things in, I can easily tilt this whole thing over by just pulling this, or I always have to have two hands on it, one to hold it down, one to take it off, and same when it comes to patching. I have to keep a hand on it and pull it off. So the tagline for this thing is, we compromised on everything except sound quality. And I believe it. The knobs are small, a little plasticky, you know, they kind of pop right off if you need them to. There's no real like, I don't know, you'll put it together and you'll kind of question if you did it correctly the entire time you're using it. With all that, I mean, it's cool. I guess the form, it's definitely form over function for most of the things. I mean, it does have a lot of functionality, but the form of it's a little weird. I mean, it's kind of more on the con side than it is pro side. I like the color, I like the idea, I like the simplicity of it. But yeah, it can kind of get to some people. All right, so on to some of the functionality of this thing. It can sound really good and really cool if you work it enough, but that can also be said about any synthesizer, so take that one with a grain of salt. Another pro is the amount of modulation you have on this thing. You got 2 VCAs, 2 envelopes. Each voice has 3 outputs, a total of 9 outputs of either, you know, audio, or these things can be tuned really low into somewhat of an LFO area. It gets really, really slow, so you can use that for more modulation capabilities. Another pro, it also comes with free cables, which is very rare when you buy any kind of module, but kind of, I guess, common if you were to buy any kind of semi-modular synth like a Mother 32 or the Okos. And last but not least, it comes with a 16-step sequencer, which also falls under the category of a con, because it's a really basic sequencer. It's 16 steps, nothing more, not really anything less unless you set a modulated something to the reset to reset it at a specific step. And the pitch CV is unquantized. Could be a cool thing for some of you, could be a bad thing. What unquantized means is it's not going to hit notes of a piano as you would normally expect it, like 12 notes chromatic in an octave. It's just kind of a bunch of random pitch values. It's, you know, analog. It's just voltage that's coming out of this controlling the oscillators. And this next one was kind of a tough one for me to swallow. It's that the gate output is always on a 16th. So every single step will output a gate trigger. So if you're using this to make a sequence, it's always going to be exactly the same, just da 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 da. And technically, it doesn't even have a gate output. What it does have is a clock output, which is again the 16th. So it has 2 clock outputs, cool, but it can't be if you want it to be an 1/8 or a 32nd, you have to double the tempo or half the tempo. It does though have 3 pitch outputs, which can be used to modulate a bunch of things, which is cool. You also have destination 1, 2, 3, or 4, which are basically jumping to different parts of the sequencer. You also have a reset as well as a direction, but you don't really have too much control over which direction it's going. It feels really basic, like there's no MIDI input, which is to be expected because this thing is so cheap. But then it brings up the question, if this is aimed for somebody who doesn't have the money to get into modular synths or Eurorack synthesis and wants to buy something like this, they're probably also in the same realm of somebody who wouldn't buy a MIDI to CV converter or have other stuff to even run this thing. So where is this thing kind of aimed at? And with that, maybe it's aimed for more of a prosumer person who does have stuff and some more knowledge about how these things work. It still feels a little clunky when it tries to get it to work with the rest of my studio because it's like only receives a clock input and a reset. This thing's always going. There's no start, stop. It's just on, and it's just on all the time unless I pull the cable or turn the volume down. And speaking of that same prosumer guy who may know a little bit more about this stuff and has some stuff to drive it, for example, I consider myself in that category. I ended up, the best sequences I got out of this thing was sequencing it from my other Eurorack system, but then at that point I was wondering, why am I not just using that system instead of this system? Why am I trying to pool these two together to make this one work when that one already works and works well with the rest of my studio? And like I mentioned earlier, the speaker's a cool idea, but you can't, with a speaker like this, you can't really enjoy the full sonic possibilities of something like this. Like, it makes some really cool sounds, and listening to it from here and then plugging it into something, it's a night and day difference. So I wish they would have better utilized this space. Maybe instead of a speaker, a really slim headphone output with, I don't know, a MIDI to CV converter or some way to kind of clock this, a USB jack, so I can clock it from Ableton or something else maybe. And where all this kind of comes to a head is with the price. It's $4.99, and for that you get, 13 or 12 modules, whatever it is, and you literally cannot beat that when it comes to Eurorack and modular synthesis. If I were to remake this with the same functionality that this applies in the Eurorack format, it would be like maybe $2,000 to $3,000. But with that being said, the modular Eurorack synth that I would make for $2,000 to $3,000 would be way more functional than this in terms of getting stuff. It'd be way more flexible. I could do a lot cooler things. It would be easier to use. So it kind of goes back and forth. Sure, it's cheap and way cheaper than Eurorack, but Eurorack could tend to be a little easier to use than this thing. But this thing is technically modular Eurorack, which is also a weird word, because isn't modular the ability to kind of change and replace things, which you can't do on this thing? But I guess that's for another time. So for $4.99, this thing's a steal. You literally cannot beat this in price. That's it. Nothing else can be said about that, but it just depends on what you expect out of it. Another thing I wanted to bring up was kind of comparability to other things. Some people have been like, why don't you get a Neutron, or why don't you get a Mother 32 instead of this thing? And I don't know, that's a tough argument to make, because those are semi-modular synths, which this is technically, I'd like to call this a semi-modular synth, because it's not fully modular. I can't take it apart. It's built in, like this is all one piece and these are just black lines drawn. Sure, I screwed everything into it from the backside, but I can't replace and switch these things around, right? But at the same time, even with those being more capable and easier to use synthesizers, that can be said about Eurorack and modular in general, because for like $2,000 to $3,000, you can get a single voice bleep bloop type of sound out of a modular synth, or you can spend, $600-700 on an XD or a used X4 or something like that and get a way more powerful, easier to use plug and play synthesizer. So having said that, this thing definitely sits in this weird middle ground of a really cheap Eurorack synth, not nearly as expensive as everything else, but it feels more modular than semi-modular synths, and they're in that same price point. So it kind of just depends on what you want. If you're trying to go into Eurorack and modular for the sound, I think you're kind of in it for the wrong reason. I find modular and Eurorack synthesis to be more about the process of creating a sound, and in that process you kind of find these cool creative nooks that you can kind of go and sit in and really shape up the sound to be something unique to you. And it's also just this fun exploration of sound and sonic possibilities out of something. So if that's something that interests you, by all means, take a look at this. But if that's not something that interests you and you want a synth that you can just turn on, go home, plug it in, hit record, hit the keys or something else and hear some sounds and record a song within an hour, stay the hell away from this, and probably stay the hell away from anything Eurorack or modular synths, because that's definitely not the case. They're meant to be a little bit more of a single kind of enclosed system with the ability to kind of work with other things, which this thing kind of carries, but again, it's just a little finicky. Finally, to wrap it all up, for $500, this thing's a steal. If you want to test the waters of modular stuff like that, sure, go for it. This thing's a great option. But at the end of the day, I'm afraid that this might be leaving some people wanting more from their ideas than this thing's actually capable of. Well, that's it from me. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, I'd greatly appreciate that thumbs up. If you didn't, give me a thumbs down, let me know. And if you like seeing content like this, feel free to subscribe. Or if you're balling out of control and want to support the channel even more, I sell these hats on synthshit.com. I got a link down below. And yeah, that always helps support the channel and whatnot. And man, I really appreciate you. I seriously do. You are awesome. Thank you so much for sticking around. Thanks for hanging out with me. And I mean, yeah, you're awesome. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it. And before this gets too gushy, yeah, you know the drill. I'll see you next week, and you already know it. Share the love, share the knowledge. Knowledge is power. Peace.